You need milk for your babies, and I need a husband." Those were the words she said to him, plain and direct as the Wyoming wind, and there was not a tremor in her voice when she said them. The October morning had come in gray and cold over the Callaway homestead, the way most mornings came in Laramie County that time of year, without ceremony, without warmth, with only the slow turning of the windmill against a sky the color of pewter. 8 shorthorn cows stood in the east corral near the water trough, their breath rising in thin white columns that dissolved into the frost-heavy air before they could become anything more. Eleanor Callaway had been up since 4 in the morning. She had fed the livestock, carried 2 buckets of water from the well, and mended a section of rope that had no business holding another week but would have to. She stood now at the open barn door with a lantern in her left hand and her right hand braced against the doorframe, watching the eastern road the way a woman watches something she cannot change but cannot stop watching either. The lane connecting the homestead to the county road stretched out half a mile ahead of her, rutted and clay red, lined on both sides by fence posts she had meant to finish connecting before the ground froze solid. She had not finished them, and the ground was close to frozen now, and that fact was simply one more item on the list she carried in her head at all times, the list that was never entirely shorter at the end of a day than it had been at the beginning. Then she saw it, a shape at the far end of the lane, moving slow, a wagon, listing to one side, the wheel rolling with that particular uneven lurch that meant a spoke was gone or close to it. 1 horse, no outrider. A wagon like that did not come through Laramie County on its way to somewhere better. A wagon like that had run out of somewhere else entirely. Eleanor Callaway had owned the Callaway homestead for 9 years, but she had been running it alone for the better part of 2. Thomas had died in December of 1880, not dramatically, not with any announcement that would have given Eleanor time to prepare herself. He had simply developed a cough in October, and the cough had become a rattle by November, and by the first week of December, he was in the ground beneath the oak tree at the south end of the property, under a wooden marker that Eleanor had painted herself, because the man from the county who carved stones was backed up until spring. She had not replaced the marker with a carved one. It still said what she had written in her own hand: Thomas Allen Callaway, a good man. That was all. She had not been able to think of anything to add that was both true and bearable, and she had not wanted to put anything there that did not meet both conditions. The ranch had been Thomas's idea, originally. He had seen it advertised in a Kansas newspaper in the winter of 1873, 240 acres with a creek on the south boundary and a well that had never run dry, and he had looked at Eleanor across the breakfast table with that particular expression he had, the one that meant he had already decided but wanted her to feel as though she were deciding alongside him. And she had looked back at him and said that Wyoming was very cold and very far, and he had said yes, and they had packed within the month. They had no children then. They tried for 8 years. There were 2 losses early on that Eleanor had never spoken of to anyone, not even to Brother Caldwell, the circuit preacher, and by the time she had made her peace with the fact that children were not coming, she had quietly transferred all of that particular grief into the land itself. The ranch had become the thing she tended and grew and worried over, the thing she stood at the barn door each morning to look at, checking to see how it had fared through the night, the way another woman might check on a sleeping child. The 30 shorthorn cows were her steadiest income. She sold milk to the trading post in Cheyenne, 20 miles east, twice a week when the road permitted, and she sold calves in the fall at the county market. The yield from 8 milking cows was more than she could move before it soured, especially in October when the trading post was cutting its orders ahead of winter. She had discussed this with old Pete Dawson, who had worked the ranch since before Thomas died and had stayed on after without being asked to stay on, simply because the Callaway land was where he worked, and he did not have another answer to the question of where he should be. Pete had told her flatly that she needed more buyers or fewer cows, and she had said she needed neither. She needed a better road to Cheyenne, and Pete had allowed as how that was also true. But the county commissioner was not going to build a road for one woman's milk operation, and Eleanor had said she was aware of that and had gone back inside without further comment, which was her habit when Pete was right about something she already knew. Old Pete was 63 years old, and his left knee had been wrong since a horse rolled on it the previous spring. He could still work, and he did, without complaint, which Eleanor respected in the way she respected most things that were done without complaint. but she had watched him climb down from the wagon seat the past several mornings, and she could see plainly what it cost him, the set of his jaw, and the way he favored the right leg on the first few steps until the left one remembered its job. She had not said anything because Pete would not have wanted her to, and Eleanor had spent enough time being the one that people watched too closely to enjoy watching someone else the same way. But she had started doing the heavier fence work herself in consequence, which meant rising earlier, which meant less sleep, which meant the headaches that came on in mid-afternoon had become a standard feature of her days, rather than an occasional inconvenience. The deed to the Calloway homestead was kept in a tin box under the floorboard beneath the kitchen table. Eleanor had put it there after the second time the county clerk, a man named Aldous Greer, had looked at her paperwork with the polite, faintly confused expression of a man who had never seen a woman's name at the top of a property deed and was not entirely certain what the procedure was supposed to be. Thomas had added her name to the deed 2 years before he died, in a moment of foresight that Eleanor now considered the single most useful thing Thomas had ever done for her, though she would not have said so to anyone. But Aldous Greer still asked, each time Eleanor brought in her paperwork, whether her husband was available to sign, and each time Eleanor said no, her husband was buried on the south end of the property under an oak tree, and he was not going to be signing anything. And Greer would nod with the careful courtesy of a man trying to be accommodating about a situation that inconvenienced him, and he would find a reason to process her documents more slowly than he processed anyone else's. She ate breakfast that morning the way she ate it most mornings, standing at the counter with a tin cup of coffee and 2 biscuits, looking out the kitchen window at the barn. Sitting at the table meant sitting across from Thomas's chair, which she had not moved, and the chair on the other side, which had never belonged to anyone and had been set there originally against the possibility of a guest who never materialized. She was not, as a rule, a sentimental woman. She did not linger over objects or over the past. But mornings were different. Mornings were the one interval of the day when the ranch had not yet given her enough to do to make thinking impossible, and in that narrow window before the work claimed her entirely, the silence in the kitchen had a shape she preferred not to look at directly. She knew the shape by feel the way you know a scar by touch without needing to look at it, the particular dimensions of a life built for 2 that was being lived by 1, and she had learned, in 22 months, that the most effective response to it was to drain the coffee, set down the cup, and walk out the door before it could say anything more specific. She had thought about the winter with more than her usual calculation this year. The hay was stacked, the root cellar was full, the woodpile was generous enough to last through January. But Pete's knee would slow the work when the ground froze hard, and there were fence lines on the north side that needed posts before December, and the north barn roof had a section of shingles that would not survive a heavy snow load, and she had known since August that both of those things needed doing. She had priced a hired man in town the previous month and discovered she could not afford one for the full winter without cutting her feed budget. And cutting the feed budget for 30 head of cattle in a Wyoming winter was not a risk she was willing to take. She had gone home from town without hiring anyone and sat at the counter with her coffee and worked the numbers again. And they had come out the same way they always came out, which was to say, without a solution. The circuit preacher, a lean and earnest man named Brother Caldwell, who came through Laramie County 4 times a year and always stopped at the Calloway Ranch for a meal and a night's shelter, had told her at his last visit in August that she was a woman of remarkable fortitude. Eleanor had thanked him and fed him and sent him on his way down the county road, and then stood at the kitchen window after he left and thought, not for the first time, that fortitude was a very kind word for what it actually felt like from the inside, which was closer to stubbornness and arithmetic than to anything that deserved admiration. She had the land. She had the cattle. She had Pete. She had the tin box under the floorboard and Thomas's name, still on the deed beside her own. What she did not have was a legal partner, a name that the county rolls and the county clerk and the county commissioner would recognize without having to be persuaded. And in Wyoming Territory in 1882, that was not a small deficiency. It was the kind of gap that stayed quiet most of the time and then made itself known all at once when it was least convenient. She had thought, in the months after Thomas died, that she could manage around it, that competence and consistency would eventually persuade the county that a woman's name was sufficient. What she had found instead was that competence without a husband's name in the territory was like a deed without a seal. It was real, and it was right, and it would not hold in every room she needed it to hold. She had watched the eastern road from the barn door for 20 minutes that morning, the lantern hanging from her hand, the cold working through her coat the way cold did when you stood still, and the wagon had come up the lane with its uneven wheel and its one tired horse, and then had simply stopped, right there at the edge of the property, where the lane met the road, as though whoever was driving it had run out of certainty at the very last moment and was not sure whether to continue or to turn back. It sat there in the gray morning without moving, and Eleanor Calloway, who had learned in 2 years of running this ranch alone that you could not afford to wait for things to resolve themselves, set the lantern down on the nearest fence post, pulled her coat straight, and walked out to see what had stopped. The wagon was a 2-seat farm rig, the kind built for work rather than for comfort, with sideboards darkened by seasons of weather and a canvas cover at the back that had been patched at least twice with cloth that did not match the original. The horse, a bay gelding with a white blaze on his nose and the hollow-flanked look of an animal that had been pushed past the comfortable limit of his reserves and was now operating entirely on willingness, stood with his head low in the particular way horses stood when they had made a private decision that patience was the only thing left available to them. The broken spoke was on the left rear wheel, which explained the list Eleanor had noticed from the barn door. The wheel was still turning, but one good rut would finish it. Eleanor stopped 10 feet from the wagon and looked at it the way she looked at everything that arrived on this property without invitation, steadily, without rushing toward a judgment. The man on the seat climbed down before she reached him. He did not jump the way a younger man would have. He climbed down with the careful deliberateness of someone who was tired to the marrow, but had decided that tiredness was not a reason to look tired, and the distinction mattered to him. He was perhaps 33 or 34 years old, Eleanor judged, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not met a razor in 4 or 5 days. His coat had been good wool once. She could see in the cut and the weave that it had been a decent coat in its time, but it had been washed and worn past the point where its origins were relevant anymore. He was not a large man, but he was solid in the way that came from years of physical labor rather than from size, and when he straightened after climbing down from the wagon seat, he stood straight, which she noticed, and kept his shoulders back, which she also noticed. He took off his hat before he spoke. She noticed that too. A man who had come to take something from her would not have taken off his hat. Before he said a word, a boy came around the side of the wagon, 9 or 10 years old, with the same dark hair as the man, and an expression that was measurably older than his face had any right to be. He was holding the hand of a small girl, 6 perhaps, who was looking at Eleanor with the frank, undefended curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to be careful about what she showed on her face in the presence of strangers. The boy was more careful. He kept himself positioned slightly in front of the girl, not in front of the man, which told Eleanor something about where the children had concluded the protection needed to come from, and that conclusion was not a comfortable one to sit with. She looked at the boy, and the boy looked back at her without blinking, and for a long moment the two of them took each other's measure in silence, the way two people do when both of them understand that this is the kind of moment that matters. Then the man reached back into the wagon bed and lifted something wrapped in a gray blanket, a bundle that resolved itself, as he cradled it against his chest with both arms, into an infant. A very young one, Eleanor judged, 3 or 4 months at the most. The man adjusted the baby against him with the easy precision of someone who had performed this particular motion so many thousands of times that it had become as unconscious as breathing. Economical, careful, completely unremarkable in a way that only came from weeks upon weeks of repetition, and the gesture told Eleanor more than any introduction might have. Old Pete came out of the barn behind her. She heard his uneven boots on the frozen ground before she heard his voice, and then he was at her left shoulder, and she knew without looking that he was reading the same information she was reading, applying the same quiet calculus. Pete said, in his low way, that he would go put some water out for the horse. The man looked at Pete and nodded and said he appreciated that, and the two of them made no more of it than that, one working man acknowledging another. Eleanor kept her eyes on the man with the baby. He said his name was Eli Marsh, and that he had come out of Cheyenne, and that he was looking to speak with whoever held the deed to the Calloway land. Eleanor said she held the deed. He looked at her for a moment, not the way Aldous Greer at the county recorder's office looked at her when she gave that answer, as though her response had introduced an unanticipated complication, but in the way a man looked when he was recalibrating honestly, reassessing the information in front of him without any particular drama about it. He said, "Yes, ma'am. Then you are the person I need to speak with." He said it quietly. He said it with his hat still in his hand and the baby against his chest. And then he opened his mouth to speak the thing he had driven 60 miles to say. And what came out of his mouth was something Eleanor Calloway, in 9 years on this land and in all the years before it, had never expected to hear. And it stopped her as completely as if the ground had shifted under her feet. Eli Marsh said it plainly, because plain was the only way he had left to say anything. He said, "I know what you need, and I know what I have. You need a husband's name on county paperwork and a man to work this ranch through winter. I have 3 children who need milk and food and a roof over their heads. I am not asking for charity. I am asking to trade work for all of it, with a legal arrangement behind it, so that you are protected and my children are fed. That is the whole of what I am proposing." Eleanor did not answer immediately. She looked at him. She looked at the boy, who had not moved from his position near the front wheel, still holding the girl's hand. She looked at the infant on his chest. Then she looked back at Eli and said, "How long has it been since they ate?" He said, "This morning. Cornmeal, what was left of it. The sack is nearly done." He told her the rest in plain language, without decoration and without self-pity, both of which Eleanor appreciated. He had homesteaded outside Cheyenne for 6 years. His wife, he said her name, Anna, had died of fever in February, 3 weeks after the youngest was born. The harvest that came after was the worst he had seen. A late frost in May had taken half the crop, and a dry July had taken most of the rest. He had borrowed against the homestead in spring, a loan from a banker in Cheyenne named Grover, and Grover had called the note in September, when the numbers made it clear there was nothing coming in. He had 30 days to vacate. He had loaded what he could, which in the end was not much. He had heard in town, from 2 different people, that the Calloway operation was run by a woman working it alone, that there was more milk on the property than she could sell before it turned, and that the ranch needed a man's labor before winter. He had taken that information and driven 60 miles on a wheel with a broken spoke, because he had exhausted every other direction available to him, and because he was a man who, when he ran out of options, ran toward whatever small chance remained rather than stopping where he was. He could work wood and he could work iron. He could handle horses and cattle. He could build a fence, lay shingles, set a post in frozen ground with a hand auger if it came to that. He had 6 years of homestead experience, and while it had not saved him in the end, he said, it was still 6 years of learning that lived in his hands and would not leave them. What he could not do, and he said this once and clearly and did not repeat it, was accept charity, because there was no version of that which allowed him to look his children in the face afterward, or to look at himself, and he was not prepared to give up either of those things. He had a name, and he had 2 working hands, and he had 3 children who needed a roof over them tonight and every night between now and spring, and he was offering all of it, without reservation and without condition beyond the work, if she would take it. He was not asking her to feel anything about the arrangement. He was not asking her to be kind about it, or to pretend it was something it was not. He was asking her to think about it the way a practical person thought about a practical problem, and he believed, from what he had heard about the Calloway operation, that she was exactly that kind of person. Eleanor asked him 2 questions. She asked whether he could drive a fence post in frozen ground. He said yes. He had done it in the winters north of Cheyenne with a hand auger and a long mallet, and it was slow and miserable work, but it could be done, and he had done it. She asked whether he would sleep in the barn until she decided otherwise. He did not hesitate. He said yes, he would sleep in the barn, and the children would have whatever she chose to give them, and if she was not satisfied with his work inside the first 2 weeks, she could say so, and he would go. No argument and no delay. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without shifting. Then she said, "The barn is warm enough. I will make up the rear stall." She said it once and went inside to put more cornmeal on to boil. Something about that moment felt like more than a transaction, more than a practical exchange between 2 people who each needed something the other had. Eleanor would not have said so herself. She was not a woman who assigned significance to things before they had earned it. But there was something in the way Eli Marsh had stood in her yard with a baby against his chest and his hat in his hand, and had not once asked her to feel sorry for him, and something in the way she had answered him without deliberating any longer than she needed to, that sat in the air differently than the rest of that morning had sat. If you are watching this from somewhere quiet, from a porch or a kitchen table, from the last corner of a long day, we would love to know where you are. Tell us in the comments, and while you are there, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one, and leave a like if it has reached you at the right moment. Then come back, because this is only the beginning. The arrangement was simple enough on paper. She had written nothing down, and he had signed nothing. It was a word given in a yard in October, with a broken wheel and a cold wind, and 3 children watching from behind the wagon. Eleanor had made harder decisions on less, and she knew it. But as she stood at the kitchen counter that evening and listened to Pete showing Eli Marsh the rear stall and the tack room and the hay, and as she heard distantly the specific sound of a baby being settled somewhere dark and quiet, she understood that nothing about sharing a roof with a stranger, even in separate quarters, even within the strictest terms of work and practical necessity, ever stayed simple for long. Simple was where things started. It was rarely where they ended up. The first morning was the most awkward, the way first mornings always are when the arrangement is new and the habits have not yet learned to work around each other. Eleanor was in the barn at 4:30, the lantern hung from the center beam, the first cow already in the milking stanchion, when she heard the barn door open behind her. She did not turn. She heard the sound of boots finding their footing in the straw, and then Eli's voice, asking where the hay fork was kept. She told him the left side of the loft ladder. He went and got it, and began forking hay to the east pen without further conversation, and Eleanor milked without speaking. And for the better part of 20 minutes, the only sounds in the barn were the milk striking the side of the pail, the hay coming down from the loft in measured amounts, and the cows making their low, unhurried sounds, the sounds of animals who had been doing the same thing each morning for years and expected to go on doing it. The girl appeared in the barn door while Eleanor was still on the third cow. She was in her nightgown with her boots on, unlaced, and she was carrying the blanket from her bed wrapped around her shoulders in a way that left a trailing edge dragging on the barn floor. She stood in the doorway for a moment, blinking at the lantern light, and then came in and settled herself on a hay bale 3 feet from Eleanor's milking stool, and watched with the concentrated, serious attention of a child who has decided something is going to be interesting and is prepared to wait as long as it takes for it to be so. Eleanor finished the third cow and moved to the fourth. The girl said, "Does it hurt them?" Eleanor said, "No." The girl said, "How do you know?" Eleanor considered this genuinely, because it was a genuine question. She said, "Because they walk into the stanchion without being pushed." The girl considered this and accepted it, and they continued in companionable silence. Lucy, Eleanor had learned her name the previous evening from Eli, turned out to be a child of relentless curiosity and very few social boundaries. She followed Eleanor out of the barn and up to the house and installed herself at the kitchen table and watched Eleanor make breakfast with the focused interest of someone who had never observed a kitchen operating at full capacity and was determined not to miss any part of the process. She asked what each thing was called. Eleanor told her. She asked whether Eleanor had children of her own. Eleanor said no. She asked why not. Eleanor said that was a question she had stopped being able to answer a good while back. Lucy absorbed this with the practical equanimity of a child accustomed to receiving answers that were not quite answers, and she asked instead whether she could help set the table. Eleanor said yes and showed her where the plates were kept. Samuel was a different matter. He came to the table for breakfast and ate without speaking, and when Eleanor asked him questions, he answered with yes ma'am and no ma'am, and nothing beyond what the specific question required. It was not rudeness. Eleanor had thought about it enough to be certain of that. It was the behavior of a child who had made a careful internal evaluation of the situation and had not yet arrived at a verdict, and who was not willing to commit himself to anything in either direction until he had. She understood that impulse. She did not push against it, and she did not try to charm him out of it. She passed him the biscuits when his plate was empty, and she did not make anything of it. On the second day, Lucy called Eleanor by her first name with the ease of a child who had already decided they were acquainted. Samuel called Eleanor nothing at all. He directed questions to his father, or to Pete, or he came to the kitchen door and stood there until Eleanor looked up from whatever she was doing, and then he asked what he needed to ask in a way that was carefully worded to require no form of address. Eleanor noticed. She did not mention it to Eli. She thought about Thomas, who had been quiet in exactly that way in the beginning, in the first months after they met, before he decided she was worth being open with. And she thought about how that kind of quiet had never meant what people thought it meant. On the fourth day, she found Samuel at the edge of the barn pen, his forearms resting on the top rail, watching the shorthorn cows with the concentrated attention he seemed to bring to most things. She came up beside him and stood there a moment without speaking. Then she offered to tell him which cow was which, if he wanted to know. He said quietly that he would like that. She went through them. The large one near the water trough was Adelaide, who had been at the Callaway Ranch since the beginning. The one with the torn ear was Ruth, who had been that way since a barbed wire incident 2 winters back. The one standing apart from the others was Maggie, who had been doing that since the previous spring, and no one had entirely figured out why. Samuel looked at Maggie for a moment and said she probably just liked the quiet. Eleanor looked at him. He was still looking at the cow. Eleanor said, "I think you may be right about that." The next morning she brought out the cattle ledger, the battered cloth-covered book she had been keeping since Thomas died, and she sat down at the kitchen table and spread it open and showed Samuel the columns: date, head count, milk yield in gallons, feed cost, sale price per head, running balance. She explained what each column meant and how she used the figures to make decisions about the herd through the course of a year. He listened without once interrupting. Then he asked whether she always did the arithmetic herself or whether she kept a counting frame. She said she did it in her head or on paper. He nodded as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. She showed him a week's worth of entries and asked whether he could add the milk yield column. He looked at it for perhaps 20 seconds and gave her the sum. Eleanor checked it against her own figure. He was right, to the half-gallon. She said, "You are good at sums." He said, "My mother taught me." He said it matter-of-factly, and he did not elaborate, and Eleanor understood both the weight of what had been said and the reason nothing more would follow, and she let it rest exactly where it had landed. The 5th evening was cold and still, the way evenings in Laramie County could be still in October, a deep, windless quiet that made the distances feel larger than they were in daylight and made even small sounds carry farther than they should. The children were in bed, Lucy with her swift and unceremonious ease, the kind of sleep that belonged to children who had used every available hour of the day completely, and Grace with the 10 o'clock feeding that Eli managed with a competence that Eleanor had stopped having to consciously keep herself from watching. She had noticed, in the first few days, that she watched him with the children the way she watched a new animal on the property. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful attention you gave to something whose habits you were still learning. By the 5th day, she had stopped noticing that she was doing it, which meant the answer to whatever she had been asking had come in quietly and settled. Eleanor had come out to the porch with her coat buttoned and her coffee held in both hands, and she had sat in one of the 2 chairs and looked out at the dark prairie. A moment later, she heard the door, and Eli came out with his own cup and sat in the other chair, and neither of them said anything about having come to the same place at the same time. The windmill turned in the darkness. The shorthorn cows were settled and quiet in the east corral. Somewhere far to the south, a coyote called once and received no answer. Eli said eventually, without preamble, that the north fence line was in worse shape than it looked from the road. Eleanor said she knew. He said he thought they could get the posts set before the ground froze solid if they started within the next 2 days. She said that was her assessment as well. He said he would need the hand auger and a long-handled mallet. She said they were in the back of the tool shed and she would show him in the morning. He nodded. She nodded. They finished their coffee. Neither of them remarked on the fact that it was the first time either of them had sat on a porch in the evening with another adult present in a very long time, because there are some things that are not improved by being said out loud, and in Eleanor's experience, this was one of them. It was Lucy who said the thing that needed to be said. The way children always end up being the ones who say the things the adults have been carefully not saying. She came to Eleanor one afternoon when Eleanor was sorting raw wool in the back room, a task Eleanor had always chosen for its quality of demanding just enough from the hands to leave the mind at liberty without direction. And she stood in the doorway and said, without any preamble, "Are you going to be our new mother?" Eleanor stopped sorting. She sat with the wool in her hands and looked at Lucy, who was watching her with the open, patient expression of a child who genuinely did not know the answer and was prepared to receive whatever came honestly. Eleanor said, "I do not know yet." She said it the way she tried to say most things, plainly, without softening it into something easier than it was. She said, "What I can tell you is that you are safe here, and there is enough to eat, and the barn is warm, and those are the things that matter most right now." Lucy thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "Samuel says you are probably nice, but you are still deciding." Eleanor said, "Samuel may be right on both counts." Lucy nodded with apparent satisfaction and went back to whatever she had been doing before she came, apparently content with what she had found out. She did not know that Eli had been in the hall until later, when she came out of the back room and found the family Bible, Thomas's Bible, which had lived on the shelf above the kitchen hearth since the week Thomas died, moved from the shelf to the center of the kitchen table. Someone had set it there closed, with the front cover open just enough to show Thomas's name written inside in Thomas's own hand, which was the name that was always written in the front of a family Bible. She stood and looked at it for a moment. The gesture was not a complicated one, but it was not a thoughtless one either, and Eleanor knew the difference. A man who put another man's Bible on the table was not trying to replace anything. He was acknowledging that the thing was there, that it had a right to be there, that the life it represented was real and did not need to be moved out of the way to make room. She did not ask Eli about it. She set the Bible gently to the side, still with the cover open, and she brought a lamp from the counter and set it close, and she left it there. There is a thing that happens in a house when people begin, without any formal agreement or deliberate intention, to accommodate one another. It is not love, and it is not yet trust, but it is something, a series of small adjustments, a willingness to move around another person without resentment in the doing, a gradual loosening of the habit of planning only for yourself. Eleanor had lived alone long enough to have stopped noticing the absence of that thing, the way you stop noticing the sound a clock makes when it has been in the room for long enough. But it was coming back now, incrementally and without announcement, in the form of a second cup of coffee set on the counter without being asked for, and a pair of muddy boots moved out of the narrow doorway, and a lamp left burning low in the hall when someone was coming in after dark. Have you ever made a decision that looked, on the outside, like nothing more than practicality, but felt, somewhere underneath, like the first thin edge of hope? Leave your answer in the comments and keep listening, because this story is not done with Eleanor or with Eli yet. The baby, Grace, had the talent that very young children have without effort or apology, which is the talent of drawing the attention of everyone nearby and making that attention feel like a choice freely made rather than a demand. Eleanor had held infants perhaps a dozen times in her adult life, always briefly, always with the clear awareness that she was a temporary arrangement and the infant properly belonged somewhere else. She had never minded giving them back. She had not expected to find herself holding Grace one October evening, when Eli's hands were both needed for the barn door latch that had been stiff since the cold set in, and he needed someone to take her for only a moment. Eleanor had taken her, the way you took something someone needed to put down. And Grace, as if she had made some private and thorough evaluation over the preceding days and had arrived at a favorable conclusion, had looked up from inside the blanket with Eli's dark eyes and had reached out and closed her fist around Eleanor's index finger with a grip that was small and absolute and entirely certain of itself. Eleanor had stood in the yard in the early dark, holding the baby and looking at nothing in particular, and something in her chest had shifted in a way that she did not have a name for and made no attempt to find one. Some things were better left unnamed a while longer. Some things earned their name by staying. Samuel came to her on the 8th day. He came to the barn where she was cleaning the milking pails after the morning milking, and he stood at the barn door in his habitual way and waited until she looked up. And then he said, "The ledger you showed me." Would you be willing to teach me to keep it? Eleanor set down the pail. She asked him why he wanted to learn. He said that his mother had kept the household accounts in Cheyenne, all of them, and that nobody had been able to read her system after she died, and his father had had to estimate some of the numbers, and some of the estimates had been wrong, and things had gone from bad to worse, faster because of it. Eleanor looked at him. She said, "I will teach you. We will start tomorrow morning before breakfast." He said, "Thank you, Miss Calloway." It was the first time he had called her anything. She noticed it. She did not make anything of it in the moment, because the moment was not one you could make something of without damaging it. She just said, "Good then," and went back to the pails. But that evening, when Pete came in for supper and called her Eleanor the way he always had for 2 years, she heard her own name in her own kitchen differently than she had heard it in a long time. Not as a thing left over from before, but as something that still belonged to someone present. Eli had, in the space of 8 days, replaced the broken wheel spoke on the farm wagon, reset 4 fence posts on the north line, repaired the section of shingles on the north barn roof that had been threatening to give way since August, and fixed the hinge on the root cellar door that had been fighting her since the previous winter. He had done all of this without being asked for any of it, which might have irritated Eleanor if he had done it in a way that implied she had not been managing adequately on her own. But he did not do it that way. He did not do it with any air of rescue or correction. He did it in the way of a man who had looked at a property and identified what it needed and was working through that list in order of urgency, the way any competent man on any working ranch would have done, the same way Eleanor would have done it herself if she had had the hours and the knee joints for it. It was useful rather than pointed, and the distinction was one Eleanor was finally calibrated to notice. She revised her initial assessment of Eli Marsh upward by several degrees. He was a man who saw what needed doing and then did it without commentary. And in Eleanor's experience, which was by now considerable, that particular combination of perception and restraint was rarer than it had any right to be in any man she had met. Lucy had appropriated Eleanor's spare wool bonnet, a plain one, meant for barn work, that Eleanor kept on the peg by the back door, and wore it everywhere, including at the kitchen table, including indoors after sundown, which Pete eventually pointed out gently was generally not the convention. Lucy said she was not taking it off because it was the most comfortable thing she had worn on her head in her entire life, and she saw no reason to remove something comfortable simply because she had come inside. Pete looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Lucy for a long moment. She said, "Leave it." Pete shook his head slightly and helped himself to more coffee. Eli across the table did not say a word, but Eleanor saw the corner of his mouth move in a way she might have called a smile if she had been confident enough in what she was seeing to call it anything. The first snow came on the 14th night, not the hard and driving snow that Laramie County was fully capable of producing in November, but a quiet one, the kind that arrived in darkness and announced itself only when the quality of the light outside changed, the window going from black to a dim, luminous gray that had no equivalent in any other season. Eleanor was awake at 4:30 as always, and she paused at the kitchen window before going out and looked at the prairie under its first thin coat of white, the windmill still turning, the shorthorn cows in the east corral already awake and observing the transformation of their world with the philosophical composure of animals who have seen snow before and know that it is a thing you wait through. Then she heard a small sound behind her and turned to find Lucy standing in the doorway in her nightgown, and behind Lucy came Samuel, and then Eli with Grace on his arm, and all of them came to stand at the kitchen window in the half-dark before any of them thought to light a lamp, and they looked at the snow together without speaking. Nobody said anything for a time. Then Lucy said that it was beautiful. Samuel said it was cold. Old Pete, who appeared at the back door already in his coat and his boots as if he had been awake for the same reason the rest of them had, said it was both of those things, and also that the hay in the south barn was going to need turning before it got wet underneath. Eleanor agreed and went to get her coat. But as she was buttoning it, she looked back at the window, at the 4 of them still standing there, Eli and his 3 children watching the snow the way people watch things they do not entirely trust to remain. And she thought that whatever this was, whatever word a person would use for it, it had a shape now that it had not had 2 weeks ago. It had the shape of something that could be lost, That thought came quietly, without drama, and it settled in her the way the snow was settling outside, evenly, covering everything. She was in the south barn that afternoon, turning hay the way Pete had said it needed turning, when she heard a horse on the lane. Not a wagon, a single horse, moving at a pace that was not a visiting pace, the hoofbeats distinct and purposeful, in a way that meant the rider had made up his mind about where he was going long before he arrived. She came to the barn door and looked out. The rider was perhaps a quarter-mile away, coming from the east, and he sat his horse the way a man sat when he was carrying a destination inside him that had already been decided. Eleanor watched him come. Pete materialized at her shoulder without a sound, the way Pete did when something needed watching. And Pete, who had been in Laramie County long enough to have a working knowledge of the kinds of men who came fast down a lane and the kinds who did not, said quietly, without looking at her, "That is not a man coming to buy milk." The rider was Victor Hale. Eleanor had not seen him in 3 years, not since the summer before Thomas died, when he had come through from Kansas City on his way to somewhere else and had stayed 4 days and eaten her food and complimented the ranch and the cattle and the view from the porch with the particular admiration of a man who was assessing rather than appreciating. He had Thomas's eyes and a face that carried none of Thomas's character. He was 45 now, or close to it, and he wore a city coat cut for Kansas City weather and city boots that were going to be a problem in the mud, and the expression of a man who had determined before he left home how this visit was going to go. He dismounted in the yard and came to the porch steps and extended his hand to Eleanor with the smooth courtesy of a man performing courtesy for an audience, and he looked past her to Eli, who had come out of the north barn at the sound of hooves and was standing in the yard with his hands at his sides, and at Samuel and Lucy near the corral. And Victor said, "I see you have company, Eleanor." She said, "They work here." He said, "Of course." He said it the way a man said of course, when the details in question were not going to matter to the conclusion he had already reached. He came inside and accepted coffee and sat at the kitchen table with his leather satchel on the floor beside his chair and said, "I will not waste your time, Eleanor." Then he reached into the satchel and brought out a document, a promissory note folded into quarters, yellowed at the edges in the way of paper that has been handled many times and filed away and taken out again. He unfolded it on the table and turned it to face her. It bore Thomas's signature at the bottom, dated March of 1879 for $300, with Victor Hale named as creditor. Victor said that Thomas had borrowed the money for the initial Shorthorn purchase, which was true, Eleanor knew, because Thomas had mentioned the loan in passing and had told her afterward that it was settled. Victor said it had not been settled. He said the interest had continued to accrue, and that the total now outstanding was $412, and that he was prepared to accept that sum in lieu of a formal lien against the property. Or, alternatively, Eleanor could deed him 20% of the Callaway land as settlement in full, which at current acreage prices was rather more than $400, but which he was offering out of consideration for keeping the matter within the family. Eleanor read the note. The handwriting was Thomas's. The terms were as Victor described them. There was no receipt attached, no record of any payment made, nothing to suggest that Thomas's assertion that the debt was settled had any document behind it. She set the note on the table and looked at Victor, who was watching her with the patient expression of a man who had watched women receive documents before and knew exactly how long it took. He met the children that afternoon. Lucy came in from the yard and looked at Victor with immediate and uncharacteristic silence, the kind of silence that said she had taken a reading and was not prepared to share her conclusions. Samuel came in and looked at Victor the way Samuel looked at everything, with stillness and without hurry. Victor crouched down and told Lucy she was a lovely girl, and told Samuel he was a fine-looking boy, and he said it with the kind of smile a man produced for a specific effect. Eleanor watched him. She thought, would you trust a smile like that if it arrived in the same hand that was holding a document against your property? She thought of the tin box under the kitchen floor and the deed inside it, and she held her coffee cup a fraction tighter. Tell us in the comments, would you have trusted Victor Hale, or would something in that particular smile have told you to hold on tighter to what was yours? Victor left that evening and took a room in town. He had given her 30 days, he said. 30 days to pay him the $412, or to arrange the land transfer, or to propose some other resolution if she had one in mind, though nothing in his manner suggested he believed she did. He rode back down the lane at dusk, unhurried, and Eleanor stood on the porch until he had rounded the bend in the road and the sound of his horse had faded. Eli came to the porch when Victor was gone. He did not ask her questions. He said, "May I see the note?" Eleanor brought it out from the kitchen and gave it to him. He read it the way a man read something when he was looking for the specific thing that was wrong, turning the paper over, holding it toward the last of the day's light, reading the dates and the terms twice through. Then he said, slowly, "The note has a payment schedule built into it. Monthly payments, beginning in April of 1879. He said, "Was there any payment ever made?" Eleanor said, "Thomas told me the debt was settled." Eli said, "Then there may be a receipt somewhere in the county records." Eleanor said, "I have been through Thomas's papers." She said it and stopped because it was not entirely true. There was a box she had brought in from the barn the previous spring, a box of Thomas's things she had found in the tack room behind an old saddle, and she had carried it to the back room and set it down and had not opened it, because the last time she had opened a box of Thomas's belongings, she had sat on the floor beside it for the better part of an hour without being able to move, and she had not been ready to do that again. That night, after the children were asleep and Pete had gone to his room and the cabin had settled into its nighttime quiet, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's Bible open between them and the promissory note beside it, and Eli sat across from her, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Eli looked up at her and said, "I will ride to Laramie in the morning. I will look at everything the county recorder has on file." Eleanor said it was a 2-day ride each way. He said he knew that. He said, "Eleanor, I am not going to let him take this land." He said it without raising his voice, in the same plain way he said everything, and Eleanor looked at him across the table in the lamplight and understood something she had been very carefully not understanding, that she was not alone in this anymore, that the weight she had been carrying had been distributed somewhere without her noticing, and she did not know whether that realization made the next 30 days feel more possible or more terrifying, and she sat with both of those feelings for a long time after Eli had gone to the barn. Eli left before dawn. He saddled the bay, who had filled out considerably in 3 weeks on Callaway feed, and was a different animal from the hollow-flanked creature who had come up the lane. The hollows behind his shoulders were filling in, and he moved with the recovered energy of an animal that had been given enough time and enough grain. Eli checked the saddle cinch twice, the way a man checked things when he was going a long distance and could not afford to have them fail, and he went without breakfast and without a long goodbye. He touched the brim of his hat to Eleanor in the barn doorway, and she nodded, and he rode out of the yard and down the lane and turned east on the county road and was gone before the sky had properly separated itself from the prairie. Eleanor stood at the barn door and watched until the lane was empty, and then she went back to the second cow. Samuel came into the barn 10 minutes later and, without a word, sat down on the milking stool at the third cow's side and began. Eleanor looked at him. He said, "My father showed me last week." She said she knew. She had seen Eli teaching him from across the yard on a Tuesday morning. She said, "You have the right hands for it." Samuel did not answer, but he finished the third cow without spilling a drop. The 3 days of Eli's absence were long in the particular way that days were long when something was unresolved and waiting. Victor came to the property on the second day, not to speak with anyone, or so it appeared, but to walk the fence line along the eastern boundary with the slow, assessing gait of a man measuring what he already considered his. Eleanor watched from the barn. Pete watched from the tool shed with the studied invisibility he had cultivated over 63 years. The children stayed inside. There was nothing Victor was doing that was technically outside his rights as a creditor with a valid-appearing claim, and Eleanor knew it, and the knowing of it was the most unpleasant part of those 3 days by some distance. Eli came back on the afternoon of the third day, riding faster than he had left, dusty from the road and cold through his coat, and carrying the look of a man who had found something and had not slowed down since finding it. He came into the yard and tied the horse and came directly to where Eleanor was standing at the barn door and said, "I found something." She said, "Come inside." He had gone to the Laramie County Recorder's office and asked the clerk to pull every document on file under the name Thomas Allen Calloway. The clerk had found, in a folder misfiled under the name of the previous property owner, a filing error from 1880 that had never been corrected because no one had reason to look. A receipt. Thomas Allen Calloway, paid to Victor R. Hale, $70, dated the 14th of July, 1879. Signed by both parties. Noted in Thomas's own hand. First installment per schedule, March note. There was more. In the same misfiled folder, Eli had found a letter written by Thomas to Victor in November of 1880, 6 weeks before Thomas died. The letter requested a full accounting of the balance remaining and proposed settlement of the remainder by the following spring. The letter had never been answered. The folder had been misfiled. Victor had never produced either document. Eli had also brought Brother Caldwell's register with him on the ride back, the circuit preacher's record book, in which Caldwell had entered Eli and Eleanor's union in November, recording it in the county register as required by territorial practice. Under the laws of Wyoming Territory, that registration made Eli a co-holder of the Calloway homestead claim. Victor's lien, if it was valid at all given the undisclosed payment history, was now being disputed by two people with legal standing, rather than one woman alone. Victor came the following morning. Eleanor and Eli were both on the porch when he rode up, and the leather satchel was on the porch table between the two chairs, still closed. Eleanor set the July receipt and Thomas's unanswered letter on the table, and Eli set Brother Caldwell's open register beside them, and Eli spoke to Victor in the same quiet way he spoke to everyone. He said Victor was welcome to take the documents to a lawyer in Cheyenne or in Kansas City if he preferred a legal opinion, but that the receipt established a payment history the promissory note did not account for, and the November letter established that Thomas had disputed the remaining balance in writing before his death, and that a court in Laramie County was likely to give the whole matter a long and expensive examination before reaching any conclusion. Victor looked at the documents. He looked at Eli. He looked at Eleanor. He picked up his satchel from the floor where he had set it, and he said, "I will be in touch." Eli said, "You know where to find us." He said us the way a man says a word that has become simply true, without any particular emphasis on it. Victor Hale's rented buggy turned east on the county road that afternoon before the sun had finished going down, and it did not come back. Eleanor stood at the barn door and watched it go until it was smaller than her thumbnail against the gray horizon, and she let out a breath that she felt she had been holding since the morning old Pete had said, "That is not a man coming to buy milk," and possibly longer than that. Possibly since the morning she had first seen the wagon on the lane and understood that something was coming toward her that she could not plan for. The feeling that came after was not triumph. It was quieter than that, and more solid, the feeling of a door held against a hard wind finally being permitted to close. She turned back to the ranch. There was still the north fence, and the root cellar to be checked before the hard cold settled in, and the ledger to bring current, and the evening cows to milk. She picked up the lantern and went into the barn. Behind her, the windmill turned in the October dark, patient and unchanged, the way it had turned through all the seasons of the Calloway land, through everything that had come and gone, and through everything that had, against all reasonable expectation, decided to stay. Spring came late to Laramie County in 1883, the way it usually did, not in a single warm day that announced itself, but in increments, in the patient accumulation of small changes. First the mud under the snow, then the mud alone, then the first pale green showing along the creek on the south boundary, faint and tentative as a question, then mornings that were cold, but no longer biting, until one morning in late March, Eleanor walked out to the barn at 4:30 and got halfway across the yard before she realized she had forgotten her heavy coat, and she stood still for a moment and considered going back for it. And then she kept walking. The shorthorn cows had calved, 11 new animals in the east pen, each one entered in the ledger by Samuel with a precision and consistency that had eventually prompted even Pete to say that the boy had a head for it. Lucy had named all 11 calves on the first day of their arrival and had declined to revisit the decision when Samuel suggested that naming cattle complicated the accounting. Grace had learned to walk in March, in the kitchen, on a Saturday morning when Eleanor was at the counter and Eli was kneeling on the floor with his hands held out about 3 feet apart. Grace stood between them, gripping his fingers. and then let go, and stood for a moment on her own, with the enormous focused concentration of something attempting a thing that was not yet quite natural to her. And then she took 3 steps toward Eli's waiting hands before sitting down hard on the kitchen floor and looking up at the ceiling with an expression of complete surprise. Eli said her name, and Eleanor turned from the counter, and Grace looked up at the sound and reached out both arms. Eleanor crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and crouched down and held out her hands, and Grace grabbed Eleanor's index fingers with both fists the way she always had, and stood up again. And this time, she did not sit back down. That evening, Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table. She sat in her chair, the chair that had always been her chair, the one that faced the window. And across from her sat Eli with his coffee, and beside Eli sat Samuel with the cattle ledger open in front of him, working through the week's entries in the lamplight, and beside Eleanor sat Lucy in the wool bonnet she still wore at supper and intended to go on wearing regardless of what Pete said about it, and in the corner near the hearth, in the cradle Eli had built in February from the lumber in the back of the tool shed, Grace slept with the profound completeness of a child who has eaten well and been held enough and has nothing pressing to attend to. Old Pete was at his own end of the table with a mug of coffee and a contentment that he would not have named as such if asked. Eleanor opened Thomas's Bible to Psalms, the page it had fallen open to since she was a girl, worn softer than the other pages from years of the same hands returning to the same place. She looked around the table. She did not say anything. There was nothing that needed to be said that was not already present in that kitchen, in the lamplight and the smell of coffee and the sound of a pencil moving steadily across the ledger page. What had begun as a bargain, made in a yard, in October cold, between 2 people who had run out of other options, had become, in the way that quiet and honest things sometimes do when the people inside them keep choosing to show up, a life. Not the life either of them had planned, and not the life that had been taken from each of them, but a life that had been chosen, carefully, in the cold and the difficulty, in the daily, unheroic work of being present for one another. And that, as any soul who has lived long enough on the frontier can tell you, is the only kind of life that was ever worth building in the first place.